This is the unrestricted free agent.
The Jimbo Fisher stuff. Were you in the room the other day when he threw?
I was. Part of the reason we had so much fun beating Clemson was because we used to talk a lot of shit to them and they couldn't handle it.
You feel fine, but your hands are shaking.
Coach Spurrier couldn't give a damn.
I want to take these athletes and mentor them.
Why can't the Gamecocks win at the SEC tournament?
So sunny all the time, so hot.
Too sunny.
Too sunny.
Fans are going to be fans, and people who understand the sport are going to talk sports.
With some weird dynamics.
It's going to be painful, but I think at the end of the day, we'll be stronger people for it.
On a Thursday morning at the end of June. Welcome in, Tim Hill, unrestricted free agent. Hope your morning's off to a good start. That's what I'm here for. That's part of the reason I'm here for, I should say, to help you get things going in the right direction. Is this the right direction for Gamecock football? I don't. Gamecock baseball, I should say. Is it? I guess it's headed in the right direction. Guys coming in. Yesterday, the news was a player from Vanderbilt going to transfer into the Gamecock program. We heard from Mark Kingston a couple of days ago now saying that the transfer portal has been good to the Gamecocks, but unable to give specifics. Gavin Cassis is the name of the player coming in from Vanderbilt, a first baseman, a highly thought-of player out of high school, but didn't really get on the field very much in his 2 years at Vanderbilt. I think hit one home run right at 300, 294 maybe, and had an injury this past year. So maybe he can be helpful. 8 players total, though, in now on the transfer portal that we know of. 6 players went out. To me, the math doesn't necessarily show up on paper to be a tremendous plus for the Gamecocks. I get it why Mark Kingston would see it that way. Will be interesting to see how it ends up playing out for sure. Good morning to you, DC. Anthony, welcome into the program as well. Thank you guys for being a part on the YouTube live stream, up and rolling on Twitter and Facebook as well, video-wise. We got the audio live stream up and rolling on Podbean. You can always hit us up on the social media, Tim Hill UFA, kind of all over the place. Twitter is where I go to the most for sure. Got it up on Instagram these days too. So the Gamecock baseball news at the top of my mind yesterday. Gamecock basketball also with a little bit of news. Nothing major with the SEC opponents announced. Basically who you get the home and homes with. Because you're going to play everybody without the divisions in the SEC anymore. So you got Georgia, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt. About as good as you can do, I think, when you're looking at 2 games against SEC opponents there. Georgia, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Vandy. I think going to be towards the bottom of the league or seemingly if you're talking about teams at the bottom of the league, those are most of them. And then Tennessee, obviously not, but at Florida, at Kentucky, at LSU will be very difficult. At Missouri is the other just single away game in conference, and then home against Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, Texas A&M. So again, I don't know if I've ever gone into a Gamecock basketball season with less information and less expectation maybe with Lamont Paris' first year. Maybe Darren Horn's. No, not Darren Horn's first year. Maybe Frank Martin's first year, but even Frank Martin brought a reputation with him for sure, and he was just his interaction on the sideline was enough to bring people in, I think. Certainly was kind of worth the price of admission kind of deal. DC says, hopefully Kingston realized this is the final straw at Carolina. Seems like he's loading up on other teams' backups. Yeah, it's hard not to come to that conclusion, isn't it? I get it that there are Clemson starters coming in. Dylan Brewer was a starter in the outfield. Jonathan French started behind the plate most games at Clemson. They're very experienced guys. but the Clemson pitcher didn't throw a lot of innings, 23 innings, I think, total. And you just got to have studs all the way across the board. And Mark Kingston understands that. I think the question, Gamecock fans, is does he have the ability to do that and do that consistently? Michael Braswell was a good player, is a good player at shortstop. A solid freshman season, but you got to be more than solid. And I know Ray Tanner talked the other day for the first time really kind of at length about this and mentioned beating Texas and Ole Miss, maybe even Vandy in a series this year, right? So clearly the Gamecocks can do it at the top end, but they also finished under 500 and didn't do it. And it's not the first time that's happened under Mark Kingston. And still, if you're looking for holes in the resume, it's a pretty big one. I think only one time in his coaching career has won more than 40 games. And that was always the benchmark for South Carolina, almost like the floor there for a stretch. I know it's very difficult. It might be more difficult to win 40 games in college baseball now than it's ever been, but South Carolina baseball is still South Carolina baseball, or Gamecock fans still want it to be South Carolina baseball for sure. Right, and Troy says, part-time starter. Brewer wasn't starting once Will Taylor got healthy. I think he ended up starting like 38, 40 games, something like that. When you play a 56-game regular season, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I understand what Troy is saying, and that's the thing that Gamecock fans know. A lot like Tavian Feaster back in the day in football, you're taking guys that the rival program is not sad to see leave. And that's a tough spot to be as a fan, man. Going to give those guys plenty of a huge chip on the shoulder and plenty of motivation and the whole thing. And I get seeing the positive of that, right, in the transfer portal these days and the whole thing, but just not enough blue chippers, I don't think, for Gamecock fans to feel good about things moving forward in the ridiculously tough SEC. Yeah, you better be loaded for bear, DC said. I've never heard that phrase. It makes sense, though. I think I get it, right? You can have your gun loaded, but if you're not loaded for a bear, you're going to be in big trouble, maybe. Or maybe that was just a typo. I have no idea. That's why I love the live part of this every morning, doing it from 8 to 10 these days, and appreciate you guys adjusting to the earlier start time. The live stuff, you never know what you're going to get exactly. Good stuff there, DC. We'll talk more about Gamecock baseball as we move on. SEC Network takeover for the Gamecocks this year on July 12th. I saw a couple of the scheduled replays will be the Women's Basketball National Championship game against UConn and the big football win against Florida, I believe. If I remember, let me double check that, confirm it as I say it out loud. I'm not quite sure about the football game. I'm checking it right now, July 12th. So the Gamecocks down on the list there towards the end. No, sorry, it's I thought I screwed that up. It's the bowl game against North Carolina. That will be the football game shown that is announced anyway. Again, July 12th, the SEC Network takeover this year for the Gamecocks. They'll be in between Missouri and Tennessee. And speaking of Tennessee, see an article out on ESPN.com about Tennessee football, a relatively long sit-down from a Tennessee grad. And Chris Lowe, by the way, who's covered the SEC for a long time for ESPN, and Josh Heupel. And I think Tennessee might be the most fascinating SEC football team coming into this season for multiple ways, right? I've got to give Josh Heupel a ton of credit. He and Shane Beamer shared the Steve Spurrier Coach of the Year, Newcomer Coach of the Year, I think it was called, the award. Did a great job. DC confirms. That's old school to him. Troy even says must be an old folk saying because I've never heard it. Oh, because I have heard it. Yeah, Troy. Well done. Well done. But are you guys with me? Maybe, nearly every SEC football program right now is fascinating in its own way, right? Outside of Vanderbilt, I kicked them out. The 13 out of the 14, you can go down the list. Kentucky, not necessarily fascinating. Mark Stoops, relatively ho-hum, and so just solid, consistent. Certainly nothing flashy that gets it going for me. But Tennessee, knowing the peak they've been at and the valleys they've been at and all the drama that's gone on in Rocky Top with the coaches, now the NCAA investigation with Jeremy Pruitt and the McDonald's bags or whatever it was, the Lane Kiffin chapter, Derek Dooley basically forcing Philip Fulmer out, and we saw his last game in Columbia. Oh, man. I guess as I talk about it, too, there are some parallels with Gamecock baseball, right? National championship, very proud program, tons of history, and struggles. Not what it once was. A lot of enthusiasm and optimism with Josh Heupel, and I thought he did a tremendous job in year number 1, but they still finished with the same record as the Gamecocks at 7-6. 7 wins. The Tennessee football, a lot like South Carolina football, is not going to be good enough year after year after year. Pretty good for a first year, especially at Tennessee, where, man, they had so many guys leave the program. It was such a cluster there. And Josh Heupel was not seen as a home run hire nationally at all. That's certainly how I remember it. Oh, a guy that has an offensive background for sure, and was at Central Florida. So coming with his athletic director, the Central Florida program had added more and more losses the longer Josh Heupel had been there. I think it was 3 years. But what he did with that offense in year number 1 was really impressive. No doubt about it. And Hendon Hooker, I think a lot of people thought he was going to be the guy going into the season, Virginia Tech transfer. He was not. The coaching staff didn't. But he clearly ended up winning the job and is now poised, I think, predicted to be a really good quarterback in 2022. Heupel's already made some big waves and signed a big-time quarterback from the state of California, and reportedly a massive NIL deal is attached to that. Was reading On3 the other day, and they put the $8 million beside it. So making some waves for sure is where Tennessee is. But I was thinking, as I said it, that I think they're the one of, if not the most interesting SEC football program out there. I mean, just staying in the East. Throw Kentucky and Vanderbilt out, right? But after that, it is wildly interesting all over the place. Georgia, because they won the national championship, and how can they back that up, right? They're interesting really on the high end. And Kirby Smart's relatively consistent and is not going to get anybody too fired up one way or the other, I don't think. But then you look down at Florida and what's going on with Billy Napier and company. Whoa, that one is what's going on there, and has a direct connection to what just happened with South Carolina a couple of days ago with Pup Howard. Big-time Jacksonville, Florida linebacker prospect signing with the game, or committing to the Gamecocks, making his commitment public with the Gamecocks. It was another big-time quarterback who On3 reported Florida offered $11 million. My body didn't even want to say that out loud. I couldn't even get it out of my mouth. $11 million. Name, image, and likeness deal. Instead, $9.5 million reportedly is what he ended up settling for to go to Miami. And DC says, I'm wondering if Tennessee can hold on to that committed quarterback from California, Nico. Maybe, yeah, that's his name. Some say he's better than the Manning kid. Morning to you too, Roger. You got the sun blazing there, and that's where we're at at the end of June talking SEC football, which is what we do here in South Carolina for sure. Talking a little bit about Gamecock baseball and recent transfers as well to start in the morning. But so just from the SEC East perspective, I put Tennessee at the top there as far as really interesting programs, right? Because it is a little bit like South Carolina and what Shane Beamer faces in year 2. So much positivity coming off year 1. Ended the season so well, South Carolina. The bowl game specifically, like I mentioned, that'll be replayed on the SEC Network July 12th, the takeover day for the Gamecock. But now what do you do for an encore, right? Improving on a 2-win season, that is not that difficult to do as a first-year head coach, especially when you move from an all-SEC schedule to a more typical schedule with some non-conference games that you got to win when you're an SEC school. At Tennessee, with everything going on, the NCAA investigation swirling and rumors and a bunch of transfers out, to stabilize that thing immediately was pretty impressive what Josh Heupel did. And man, when Tennessee and South Carolina played, I don't know how any Gamecock fan could have felt good about their first-year head coach over the other first-year head coach, because that was the bottom, I think, maybe for Gamecock fans. Even after the Will Muschamp era, right? You look at that Tennessee game, you think, hey, this doesn't look like it's going to work out with the next guy either. And one of the few things that South Carolina could feel good about in recent years is, hey, we got Tennessee. Remember that Tennessee program that used to dominate us? We've been better than them for the last, decade. And it's a cluster over there. They don't know what they're doing. And they got NCAA issues. And then they just seemingly went up and down the field there in Knoxville last year at will in the first half. So to give Josh Heupel tons of credit for being able to score points. I think he's going to be able to do that to some degree. The question will be, all right, now that you've been in the conference for a year, now that other teams have seen exactly what you did, how you did it, SEC defensive coordinators love information. They love reps and seeing it live for sure. All right, what are you going to do moving forward? But if Tennessee keeps getting players, like it seems like they are, I think right now ranked ahead of the Gamecocks in the recruiting rankings, and mentioned that big-time quarterback from the state of California. You keep getting guys like that, you can probably keep doing it. I don't know if you can do it at the pace that they did it last year in year number 1, and then knowing what the Tennessee fan base is, can you do it at their satisfaction level? Because you think expectations are going to be big for the Gamecocks with Spencer Rattler transferring in and having won 7 games in year number 1 for Shane Beamer. I get it. But compared to the Tennessee fan base, I think South Carolina fans are really rational and level-headed in a lot of ways. No, that's probably overstating it a little bit. See you guys weighing in. Continuing on the YouTube live stream, Colette and Justin with the good mornings. Morning to you guys. June 30th, a great time to talk about what's going to happen this year on the football field from the South Carolina perspective and the SEC perspective at large. And mentioning this off of a lengthy ESPN.com article on Tennessee football. It looked like Josh Heupel was headed out to a first family vacation in a while and sat down with Chris Lowe, covered the SEC for a long time. Maybe a slight Tennessee bias being a Tennessee grad. But there is no doubt Josh Heupel deserves a bunch of credit for year number 1. Now, how do you keep it going? And will the NCAA come down with any kind of restrictions, penalties, and how might that affect recruiting? How that's sold in recruiting is fascinating to me, right? It reminds me of this PGA Tour Live Series thing where loyalty gets brought up, and then I get confused real quick. Like you have to be loyal to an entity in the PGA Tour that hasn't listened to a lot of loud complaints and I think really, really valid points by especially the sport's most popular golfers. But if you consider another offer out there, you're just completely disloyal in the whole thing. Well, when NCAA issues come up, I feel like these schools use the loyalty card, or hey, when things get difficult, you don't turn your back on your family and the whole thing. Like, wait a second. You allowed the problems to happen. You're responsible for that. And now you got to pay the consequences. This reminds me of, schools who have missed bowl games, who have not been allowed to go to bowl games recently. And to keep guys in your program from exploring their options and moving over to a program that hasn't broken the rules and does get to go to bowl games, like that's a big guilt card to play, man. I have a hard time listening to that a lot of times. So I would assume that Tennessee would go that route, just like every other program has, but maybe Josh Heupel specifically won't, since he wasn't there. But I'm guessing that there got to be questions on the recruiting trail about the potential of that happening. I don't know how you battled that exactly, except to say that wasn't us. And from what we've heard, there aren't going to be NCAA issues. They haven't come up with anything yet. So that was all just media hype or whatever. I don't know how you get around that, and then how parents can just nod and go along with it, or families or players or whatever. To me, that seems like quite the hurdle to jump over, especially in the first year where Tennessee was. But hey, give them credit. Great season last year for where they were, considering offensively especially, and seem poised to continue that. But the expectations, I think I mentioned it maybe yesterday, saw a graphic. Some Vegas book had odds to win the SEC. It was Alabama favored, then Georgia. Then I don't even remember who was number 3, but Tennessee was number 4. Fourth best odds to win the SEC. Coming off of where they were, that is quite the jump. But now that I think about it, going through SEC programs and doing it maybe from the East first. So we always talk about South Carolina. Really interesting spot with Shane Beamer. Certainly getting to relevance is where the Gamecocks are, and that bowl game was a huge piece of doing that. Beating Florida and Auburn last year. Massive wins. Huge step forward for Shane Beamer. Kind of a stamp of legitimacy, I think, in year number 1 in a lot of ways. From outside, maybe. From elsewhere in the SEC and the country. I think he already had built up a pretty big cachet with Gamecock fans who knew him from his prior stint as an assistant, followed him around, and listened, heard, connected to the message that he was sending loud and clear, and doing it unlike any other coach had ever done it when he took the job. And as he was getting ready for season number 1 and during season number 1, but you got to win for those words to mean what they're supposed to mean. You got to compete at the highest level, and knocking off name brands like Auburn and Florida, and then sticking it to Mack Brown in North Carolina in the bowl game. Just, it can't be overstated how important that was for Shane Beamer in year 1. How impressive, too. But let's start with the Florida one. So we've got South Carolina, Kentucky, Vandy. No need to talk about them. Kentucky, steady. They're a basketball school anyway. They're going to be solid again. And they're going to be, the way the preseason magazines read this year, Georgia in the SEC East, and then who knows for second place. I think maybe Tennessee is favored more than anybody else, but certainly Kentucky would be the conservative pick there, Florida, and then South Carolina. Missouri, Eli Drinkwitz is doing a good job and is going to have to continue to do more, get more players, and build more of an identity, I think, to get anywhere close to relevancy. I think he is in a very similar boat, if I zoom out from the SEC perspective, as Shane Beamer is. And the programs had gotten to a point where they were pretty irrelevant in the SEC. Missouri probably more than South Carolina just because they were newer, farther away, easier to forget about. But both of those guys, I think, similar in age, similar in recruiting pedigree, doing a good job on the trail. And I think Drinkwitz is even more aggressive in his public persona, being willing to take a shot or two, not afraid to make some waves with comments. Not that Beamer is afraid. I think he's just maybe not quite as edgy, just in personality. But certainly don't put Missouri anywhere close to it. But the top two programs in the East right now, top two interesting ones to me, Tennessee, Florida. And it's really more the fan base and their relationship with the coach than anything else, right? I mean, Georgia was forever not happy with Mark Richt, who was winning SEC East titles, but wasn't competing for national titles. So they boot him out, and they bring in Kirby Smart, and it has paid off and then some. It paid off with the first national title since 1980. Clearly the right move. Now it's a matter of, all right, you've been going the Nick Saban model. He's your mentor. He's clearly how you've structured your program. Can you make Georgia the Alabama of the East? Can you maintain that ridiculous championship level that Alabama's been able to maintain in the East? And there are very few signs that Georgia can't do that. That Georgia isn't doing that. That's what I see right now. I don't know how you can see it much differently with what we've seen on the field, what we've seen off the field from a recruiting standpoint, with just kind of who Kirby Smart is. It seems to be that they seem to be there to stay for a long time. I don't see any cracks. Now, the Florida situation is the exact opposite, isn't it? You asked me who I would prefer to coach my college football team from an SEC standpoint, and I get to Dan Mullen real quick. I mean, getting Mississippi State to number one in the country, the job that he did at Mississippi State was tremendous, and then it should have been a massive red flag. We should have probably talked about it more. When it came out, and I forget what media outlet did it, I think it was actually maybe on a podcast Dan Mullen's wife was on while they were at Mississippi State, talking about how absolutely ridiculous the Florida fan base was. And I think she had like an encounter, or she told a story about just going to the grocery store and getting just the stink eye, or having people come up to her and being unsatisfied with. This was when Dan Mullen was Urban Meyer's offensive coordinator at Florida. They clearly had already, I think they had won a national championship, and it was maybe the next year where they had one loss or two losses, and just getting the feel of how underappreciated her husband was, the coaching staff was, how unacceptable that was to the Florida fan base, and how almost unsatisfied they were going to be unless they were winning a national championship. Remember, she recounted that while she was at Mississippi State. And that got out publicly. And it was surprising to me then that Dan Mullen ended up going back, but on paper it made a lot of sense. And Florida, Steve Spurrier, I think maybe Steve Spurrier to Urban Meyer, right? And I know Ron Zook was in between, and we'll forget about that. But Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer made it look so easy at Florida that I think we've all taken it for granted that Florida just wins in the SEC. Easy to forget the pre-Steve Spurrier era where they didn't. Easy to forget Ron Zook. But Jim McElwain, a little Muschamp before him, obviously. That's one thing, right? If you don't get the right guy in there, you can't win in the SEC. But Dan Mullen wasn't that guy, right? He was as proven as you can nearly possibly be. And Florida chewed him up and spit him out, and he seemed to be okay with being done at the end. That was absolutely fascinating. And now enter in another really fascinating character in Billy Napier. And having had some opportunities at Louisiana Lafayette, but it looked to me like he was just sitting there poised to take that LSU job, right? Wasn't that how you guys read that thing? Like, yeah, Vanderbilt's not going to be a place that you want to go and win. I mean, you want to go and have any kind of expectation of winning. So I understand they're interested in you and you're not that interested at Louisiana Lafayette. Okay. It's aggressive, not taking an SEC job, right? But you must know something that I don't know. You must see something in the state of Louisiana, especially. And then LSU absolutely implodes last year. And Napier was just sitting there. Still pretty good Louisiana Lafayette team program. I thought it was going to be near automatic that he was going to be their guy. And they go, and if you know anybody that saw that coming with Brian Kelly, please point me in their direction. That thing could not have come more out of left field in college football, I think, for 99.9% of people. I mean, maybe there's some revisionist history there, and you can see that there was friction between Kelly and the Notre Dame administration or whatever it is. But we talk about fits all the time, and I get it. Nick Saban came down to LSU and won a national championship. Nick Saban is a West Virginia guy who has become an Alabama guy, right? But he's not an Alabama guy. Come on. But he's made it work at Alabama, obviously. Proven that you don't have to be raised in the good old boy South to be a fit as a head coach in the SEC and dominate and go down as one of the, if not the best college football coach of all time. But again, the anomaly. That is the exception. Nick Saban is the exception in college football right now in a lot of ways. So I thought with the familiarity of Louisiana, and I went to my freshman year in college in Shreveport, Louisiana, a little school called Centenary, and I got to see it firsthand. Louisiana culture at the age of 18 was something, man. I didn't see it coming. And the best way I know how to explain it is coming back to North Carolina for the first time at Christmas break. It was Thanksgiving. Sitting down to eat in a restaurant that I'd eaten with my buddies in high school a dozen times. I put the food in my mouth. It was hash browns, right? Chewed it and was like, this has no taste. I had no idea that it had just kind of seeped its way. I love Louisiana food, by the way, and spicy stuff now and the whole thing, but that is the best way I know how to explain Louisiana culture. That it is very prideful and colorful. And Orgeron certainly was that guy. And winning a national championship at LSU was massive, and then so was the fall from there. And so I thought Billy Napier was going to be that guy immediately. That made sense. You have to know, I think, a lot about any SEC job to have success there. You got to know. SEC football jobs are at the top, right? But we've seen this, I think, to varying degrees just at South Carolina, right? Greg Martin didn't know what he was getting himself into with that South Carolina basketball job. He'll tell you himself. I mean, I feel like he told me. It's like, yeah, I didn't know. There's a lot of stuff we had to work through at this job that other jobs don't have to work through. Now, I don't know what all those details are. I just know what I'm told, and when we saw the pace at which Frank had to build the program was a lot slower than he expected it to be, and I think a lot slower than happens at other programs. I think that's a fair characterization there. I think I don't know how that applies to the South Carolina baseball job, but I'm not sure that Mark Kingston was aware of just how demanding that job was going to be, of maybe how small the margin of error is, and how intolerant the fan base is of mediocrity. I know he knows that now. And again, a Vanderbilt first base reserve, the latest transfer news yesterday coming down for Gamecock baseball, the 8th player brought in. Another guy from Memphis, I think a Southern Miss guy, 3 from Clemson, and I think it might be 2 from Cal. There's definitely one pitcher from Cal. But yesterday's stat line coming with the Vanderbilt reserve is just having played in 20-some games, I think, in 2+ years there. A .294 average, hit 1 home run. Big-time prospect coming out of high school, had an injury last year. Again, don't want to be disrespectful at all to the players coming in. I get what they're doing. They're joining a national championship former powerhouse program and trying to get them back there. I don't blame them a bit. It's just, I think, difficult for fans. Like DC hit us up a little bit earlier and said it looks like they're trying to go to the portal and what did he say exactly? Let's see. Looks like he's loading up on other teams' backups. And you compare what South Carolina is doing right now in the transfer portal from baseball to what LSU has done, and it is apples and oranges, night and day. And Gamecock fans expect South Carolina baseball to be better than LSU baseball. It's just simple. Remember Ray Tanner eliminating Smoke Laval and LSU back in the day, that first 3-year run in the College World Series. I think that was the 03 season. And Ray Tanner learned a lot from Skip Bertman. We've had his former assistant Stuart Lake on here telling us Skip Bertman stories, and the one that sticks with him, that has been repeated the most anyway, is score first. But if you don't score first, make sure you score last. It's one of those Yogi Berra isms almost. But I mentioned all of that stuff. Mentioned fit and jobs and the whole thing, just simply from the fascination I have right now with SEC football and Florida specifically. So this little tangent came off of an ESPN.com article about Tennessee. I think Tennessee, second most fascinating program right now in the SEC East. Maybe 1A and 1B, right? Because the Josh Heupel hire, I wasn't impressed with it when it happened at Tennessee. Knowing how the Jeremy Pruitt era ended with NCAA issues, with the McDonald bag reports, and then seeing all the guys, how many transfers? It was massive transfers out. And Josh Heupel's Central Florida record went like this, downward trajectory, right? Continued to lose more games every year he was there. Now, granted, he came in, I think, off the undefeated season, so there was only one way to go with gravity there. But that one was a tremendous first year, I think, from an offensive standpoint especially. And Josh Heupel made a statement immediately that, to me, he wasn't going to be the next in line. I mentioned Lane Kiffin blows up in their face. I get it. He had a relatively decent season in his 1 year there, but he just tore up Tennessee tradition by moving on and going to Southern Cal. Enter Derek Dooley, pretty much a dumpster fire across the board. Became a laughing stock. And Jeremy Pruitt didn't do much to keep that from happening. I think he'll go down in history as part of the era of Nick Saban disciples. That didn't work out. Throw Will Muschamp at South Carolina in there as well, where guys, they knew how to coach defense, or they came in with defensive reputations and they never figured out how to be head coaches. I think it's fair to say Jeremy Pruitt will be in that same boat as Will Muschamp. So now you add in Josh Heupel, who's a guy that almost won the Heisman Trophy at Oklahoma back in his playing days, who clearly has the offensive background and had done that from an offensive coordinator with a lot of success, translated that into success at Central Florida, but not at a massive can't miss. He's going to be the next guy to jump to a Power 5 kind of reputation. At least that's not what I had out of him. And then we saw what happened last year with the Gamecock and Tennessee game in Knoxville, where Tennessee was playing basketball on grass, it seemed like, could almost name their score at some point. And that was shocking to me. Now, South Carolina rebounded from there. Tennessee kind of came back to reality a little bit. They both finished with 7 and 6 seasons. And that leads us to year number 2, where the expectations are big for Shane Beamer from South Carolina's perspective. But big, I think, would be 7 to 8 wins in the regular season. I think if you're a Gamecock fan and you're expecting 9 wins, a 9-3 regular season, now you can hope for it. If you're expecting that, I think you cut the gummy in half. It might be how G.A. Mangus would put that. I think you got to say, whoa. Easy. 9-3 is a really, really good season. And you show me the math, how that's going to work out on paper with the schedule. And we're going to have some disagreements on that one. Now, possibility, absolutely. Much better percentage chance for that to happen this year than the last, I don't know, however, handful of years, maybe since Steve Spurrier was gone. I guess maybe that second year. Will Muschamp won 8 games in the regular season. The SEC East was wildly down that year. It can happen. But the expectation, I don't think, is there that it needs to happen kind of thing. I think at Tennessee, that's how they see things a lot more than at South Carolina. And so to give them the optimism, the enthusiasm back into the program, obviously a massive accomplishment for Josh Heupel and company. Now he's got to back it up. And it's got to continue to grow. And they got to do all that with NCAA investigations still looming over their head, possible violations. How they get out of that with any violations, I have no idea. Get more of your comments in on the program. See you guys interacting and really appreciate it on the YouTube live stream this morning. Troy talking about other SEC East programs. Georgia had an NFL defense last year, just like LSU had an NFL roster in 2019. I don't think Georgia will drop off like LSU did, but I do see some drop off. And by that logic, you got to have some drop off, right? I mean, a lot of people think that might have been the best college football defense in history from Georgia last year. And Teddy D just wants to go back to wrestling. If we take today's discussion back to wrestling, and Teddy D was talking about maybe live series and PGA Tour golfers being good and bad wrestlers, good and evil wrestlers yesterday. Florida fans are like the manager Jimmy Hart, loud, obnoxious, overrated. Does that mean they have a tennis racket with him? Is that what he's the one, right? The Hart Foundation, I think, always had the tennis racket. Good stuff. And I want to get more into Florida. Hope with a good morning. Morning to you, Hope. And DC says, I'm thinking 6 wins when it comes to Gamecock football. And I think, again, that's a really rational way to look at 2022. There might be some Gamecock fans that hear that and say, come on, man, you got to be more optimistic than that. No, he didn't say he's hoping for 6 wins. He said he's thinking 6 wins. And a big difference between the head and the heart. I think that's a pretty even-keeled way of looking at it. And if you go down the schedule, I get how you come to 6 a lot more than how you get to 9. But back to the Florida situation. So now you got Dan Mullen. See, and Hope similar, right? Thinking 6 to 7. Again, that would be a solid second season for Shane Beamer, I think. To me, you want to improve, ideally. So 7, I think, would be a nice 2022. 8 would be a tremendous one. 6 would be acceptable, I think, from a Gamecock fan perspective. Less than that, then you start to get concerned, and the pendulum of momentum kind of swings the other way. You don't want that for sure. In DC, I think that's I'm assuming you're just saying on offense, because Cam Smith is clearly an NFL guy. I think Darius Rush has great numbers in coverage from last year as well. Would be considered an NFL guy. Trying to think on the defensive side of the ball where that's going to happen. I mean, NFL guys haven't been the issue at South Carolina in the last several years. They've been NFL guys. And outside of the quarterback position, I don't think you can say Spencer Rattler is a clear-cut NFL guy. But Jaheim Bell seems to be for sure. See, Josh Vann, with what he did last year, you don't become the guy at South Carolina at wide receiver and not be considered an NFL guy. But I think you're underselling some of those guys. But if you want to go clear-cut, okay. So let me get back to the Florida situation, right? Because that Dan Mullen implosion, I guess maybe Florida fans can rationalize it with the way college football has changed in general, right? With the name, image, and likeness, and Dan Mullen clearly kind of against that whole wave and saying, yeah, I'm going to put my name out for NFL jobs because I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I want to mess with all that. And it's kind of an old school approach. I've never considered Dan Mullen like the part of the old guard. From an age standpoint, he's not way up there in years to where I would think that, he's just not going to change his ways. And maybe we didn't realize how kind of set he was in his system and the whole thing. Well, Jim Cornette, I think, is maybe the dude's name in wrestling with the tennis racket. My bad. Not a wrestling aficionado, especially with the managers. My apologies to the wrestling nerds out there. But Dan Mullen, I thought, was set up to have a ton of success at Florida. And I think Anthony Richardson's pretty good. So current talent at quarterback wasn't the issue like it typically is in a lot of places. It was Mullen's inability to stockpile big-time recruits or keep big-time Florida recruits that they're just used to getting from leaving and going other places. And obviously, last season just fell apart completely. And his exit, man, his just demeanor on the sideline in Columbia, and I get it. I think he was under the weather for the game and the whole thing, but that's when, like, Mike White was that guy for Florida basketball several times. Felt like just came in and kind of took his medicine. And I was just shocked that you didn't see more just fight, more intensity, more fight put up, more obstruction is the word that pops up in my mind. Like, you at least got to go down swinging kind of thing and to show your team how unacceptable things were. And then we talked about it this time last year, right? Dan Mullen with the Missouri thing was really weird, and wearing the Darth Vader stuff after the game, the 2020 game. And I mean, I guess that whole environment with the COVID situation, playing the conference game only, doing it without fans mostly, and him getting on to pretty much Florida administration, right, towards the end, and saying that they should be able to have fans in there, a lot like Texas A&M and the whole deal. It just seemed like if he wasn't getting his way, then behind the scenes there were a lot of issues. And I mean, we see it with Nick Saban in front of the scenes, right? If he doesn't get his way, he throws a fit. And Jimbo Fisher put it very clearly recently. But that's exactly how it works behind the scenes too, which is no surprise. And we've heard for years and years and years how you don't want to work for Nick Saban. It is not fun. It'll help your career. You're going to win, but you're not going to have fun doing it. And you're not. He's not going to get a lot of those coffee mugs. Those Michael Scott coffee mugs, best boss ever. He ain't getting a lot of those. But I thought Dan Mullen was going to be a guy who could make the adjustment, who was in that sweet spot for Florida, proven head coach, but not completely on the backside of his career. Still a lot of good years left in him. And one of those guys who helped evolve college offenses and would continue to be kind of on the cusp of being able to move the football against college defenses. But I think it turned out that he is a lot more like Steve Spurrier from his offensive perspective. Guy that had a system, was going to run his system. Defenses eventually kind of caught up to that, and whereas Steve Spurrier was able to make an adjustment at South Carolina and go to more of a defensive-led team and then running the football, especially with Marcus Lattimore and Connor Shaw being able to make enough plays for him on offense, that Dan Mullen just wasn't, or he just was going to be satisfied with taking his money and going home and not making the adjustment to 21st century college football, including name, image, and likeness and transfer portal stuff. It just wasn't something he wanted to deal with. So enter Billy Napier, a guy that is very familiar to South Carolina fans, having coached at Clemson, and Dabo Swinney parted ways with him early on. I think coached Furman before then, played at Furman, if not coached there, and has coached at Alabama as an assistant, been around the league, been a guy associated with not the most outstanding reputation, let's say. But what he did at Louisiana, Lafayette, tremendous. Oh, yeah, DC points out, it's a good one. That almost brawl he started with then Vandy coach Derek Mason was nuts. Dan Mullen. Yeah, I mean, that's another example, too, of, like, is this guy all right? Is he mentally stable? What's going on with him? Because it's one thing to go to be energetic on the sideline and within your team or at the officials, and that's what I was expecting in Columbia this past year. That's what I always expect from coaches. That's kind of like the baseline. Like, that's your job. You have to be that for your team. Sometimes, very rarely, I think you cross that line. You feel like you need to cross that line and stand up for your team directly at the other team, right? And typically this is a basketball thing because you're so close and the whole thing. Very rarely does this happen in football, right? I mean, I guess maybe in some post-game handshakes, we've seen it through the years, the Jim Harbaugh thing back in the day. And usually maybe on the post-game podium, some shots are taken. But it's rare these days. I mean, the Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban thing will always be at the top of that list. But again, that was May, right? And that was name, image, and likeness, and that was coming off a historic recruiting class and coming off an A&M win against Alabama. A lot of different factors for that one, but the Dan Mullen kind of exit, it seemed like it was just a whimper. It was like a firework that never went off. Just kind of off he went. And so that, I bring up all of that because that's the environment Billy Napier is coming into, right? And that is wildly important for any head coach to understand. All right, what kind of pool am I jumping in here? And some rough waters at Florida, and a lot of work to do, right? A lot of times, I think you can give Will Muschamp credit for an upgrade from what is the word I'm looking for here? I know I can come up with it. It's on the inside, not foundation, something like foundation. It is so close. So tip of my tongue. I'll come up with it in a second. The internal workings. I'll just work it out. How about that? Well. But Will Muschamp definitely upgraded facilities, or oversaw that, was there while that happened, upgraded the recruiting operation that Steve Spurrier had a much more of an old school, outdated approach to, that he could get away with up until he couldn't at the end. Infrastructure. There it is. There's the word. Infrastructure updates. Infrastructure solid with Will Muschamp. I think nearly everybody who's followed his career would say, yeah, Sunday through Friday, good guy to have running your program. Saturday, don't know what happens. It doesn't go well a lot of times. But you have that kind of guy. It's kind of the opposite of Steve Spurrier, right? You want Spurrier calling your plays on game day. You don't necessarily want him leading the charge in recruiting, or even being that guy on the practice field who's going to get the best out of your players. That ain't him. He's a game day guy. Best ever game day guy, in my opinion. And certainly not just mine. So that's the, I think, solid situation that Shane Beamer in a lot of ways found himself. Now, there was, from a fan base standpoint, there's a lot of stuff that happened, man. It was a fractured fan base, and you saw fans calling out former players and going back and forth social media, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but compared to Florida, I think, compared to Tennessee, I think from a coach coming in, the expectations and what's already there, the whole thing, I think I would put South Carolina 1. And then Florida and Tennessee, I don't know. Neither one makes a strong case for number 2. Could they be 3A and 3B? Is that how I can do the math today? 1 and then 3A and 3B out of a 3-team deal? I guess maybe with the mess that Tennessee had been for so long, so far removed from Phil Fulmer and the success, that you might have to give the nod to Tennessee, because the expectation clearly at Florida is to win the SEC East every year. And if not, you better finish second. And anything other than that is a complete failure for Florida football, I think, based off of Steve Spurrier's expectations set. Urban Meyer took it to the next level, and a lot of Florida fans are still stuck back there. That's how I read that situation. So that's where Billy Napier is. And some recent recruiting stuff has already gotten Florida fans up in a tizzy and chirping on social media that they're not happy with their head coach who hasn't coached a single game. And that's where we are in 2022 with social media and everything else, and the way that college programs go. Again, not a recruiting nerd, but understand the importance of it. And the way that word gets out, it can snowball so quickly, especially negatively for these big-time head coaches. And I guess especially maybe for a guy as a Florida head coach, but not with the proven track record that other Florida head coaches have brought in. And even Dan Mullen, who did, he couldn't survive it. So good luck to Billy Napier in Florida this year. I don't know what it's going to take for Florida fans to feel good about that situation moving forward. I know it will take more than what Shane Beamer had to do in year number one and what Josh Heupel had to do in year number one. And that's a pretty big task to take on. I know Napier's won a bunch of games already, so I'm not trying to tell you that I'll be shocked if he can do it. I'm just trying to tell you, man, that is a wildly interesting SEC program right now. I'm going to go ahead and put them above Tennessee because it's still year number one and we haven't seen it play out at all. So that's more interesting to me just because we haven't seen it. But there's a year two situation in the SEC that trumps even that we haven't got to today. We'll do that after take a little quick break here. Let you hear a recent comment that Stuart Lake had to make on the program about the Carolina-Clemson baseball rivalry, and we will get back into the Carolina baseball situation coming off another transfer, some more transfer news from yesterday. We're rolling into hour number 2 here. It's Tim Hill, unrestricted free agent.
He's going to bring the rivalry back to this game. This is not going to be kumbaya anymore, probably like it was a little bit with Monty. Well, Eric Backage isn't looking for that. And you could probably get that from his interview when he said, we're going to dominate the state. Well, he's going to have that Coach Leggett, Clemson type feel to it. So South Carolina better get ready.
A sip of water in there. Cleared out the throat, ready to roll here in hour number 2. Thanks again for being a part of the show. Streaming live 8 to 10 every morning, moving things up a little earlier. Thanks for making the adjustment with us, or if you catch us later as well, that's much appreciated too. YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, where we're streaming live on video, and then live audio is Podstream, by the way, just like a radio show would be, comes at you live through that Podstream app, the Podstream link, and then send it out to all those podcast platforms audio-wise after that. So what do you got? I don't even know what. Apple's at the top of the list. I do the Google podcasts. I know everybody kind of does their own thing when it comes to podcasts, but I really appreciate you guys participating, being a part of the program, supporting it, however you are doing it. Teddy will start us off. What do you think Ole Miss fans expect after Lane Kiffin came out of the gate so strong in his first 2 years? Good question, Teddy. I think what they expect and what they'll tolerate maybe are the questions to ask in the SEC, right? I think that's where Tennessee has gotten a little less ridiculous through the years, I think, because of the lack of success they've seen. And Lane Kiffin's got to get some credit for that. Started off, right? And that's what the Florida program, I think, is still at a ridiculous level at. What they expect is a lot, and then what they tolerate isn't very much, right? The losing that is tolerated. The losses on the recruiting trail recently, tough for them to tolerate. So I think Ole Miss fans are just a lot more tolerant simply because of where they are in the pecking order of the SEC. They understand. I think they get it. I think we all get it, right? At least, all right, so being 44 years old, I was not old enough to see Archie Manning and the success that he had for Ole Miss. Certainly saw Eli Manning's moderate success. Ed Orgeron, a flop at Ole Miss. Just trying to go back through the years. Ole Miss hasn't been relevant nationally most of my life. Lane Kiffin makes them relevant. And so I think I think they're good with being relevant by and large, or they should be. Maybe they're not. And coming off now a national championship in baseball, maybe they'll demand that much more, or I don't know. Maybe they'll just be drunk still in football season, celebrating still. And good for them, man. Such a great story. Fun to watch. Fun to see the takeover in Omaha. And I know we talked about it a bunch on the program. Sorry to digress there. So, but I mentioned all of that because this goes into the psychology of the fan base, the environment, right? We've seen it at South Carolina. I find it really hard to believe that it was just massive coincidence that the best years of Gamecock football happened to coincide with the best years of Gamecock Gamecock baseball. National championships and playing for a third in a row came right in that streak, the wheelhouse of winning the first SEC East Division in 2010, and then 3 straight top 10 finishes. No one thinks that's a coincidence, right? I mean, there is definitely something to confidence and programs rubbing off on each other and the whole thing. Now you can look at South Carolina recently and say, hey, what about the women's basketball program? That hasn't necessarily translated over, and definitely true. But also that 2017 year, the first national championship for the women and the Final Four season for the men, is that a coincidence? A total coincidence? I find things like that really hard to believe, that they're complete coincidences and have nothing, completely independent of each other. So the question again from Teddy, what do you think Ole Miss fans expect after Lane Kiffin came out of the gate so strong in his first 2 years? I think they expect to score a bunch of points, to be relevant, to not take a back seat to anyone when it comes to how their program is presented, is talked about, is going to be aggressive and recruit and the whole thing. And yet they understand. They're not Alabama. I think you finish somewhere in the middle of the pack in the SEC West, Ole Miss fans going to be okay with that. Maybe not. Maybe I'm completely off on the Ole Miss fan base. It's one of the few places in the SEC I haven't been to a game at. But I've heard Grove is pretty cool, but once the game starts, you're not missing anything. Vaught Hemingway is not exactly a cathedral of college football, so I would much rather go just for the pregame atmosphere. But I mean, having grown up going to South Carolina games, I understand the tailgate scene. So that was one that I think I should have made earlier on in life, and now I'm not feeling like I'm missing out. But to me, in the SEC West, there is one program by far that is the most interesting one and will be fascinating to watch this year for so many. It almost always is fascinating to watch this program in multiple ways. I mean, the highs and the lows. I forget what was I reading recently that had just some massive ups and downs. I forget which program it was. Maybe it'll come to me. I mean, infrastructure finally came to me a couple of minutes ago, so maybe this one will come to me as well. But, Northwestern football. They've gone division championship last the last few years. I was reading a preview about, because I mentioned Ryan Helinski on the show the other day, and then I was like, yeah, I guess he's still going to be trying to be the starting quarterback there. And that's exactly what the preview article was talking about, how quarterback has been pretty much a train wreck the last several years. They hadn't figured it out. Ryan Helinski was the guy last year after basically beating out Clemson transfer Hunter Johnson, who started the season. But when Helinski took over, it wasn't very good either. I think finished with 3 touchdown passes and 4 interceptions for the year. My body wanted to involuntarily cough just saying those numbers, I think. Involuntarily cough. So I need to look up some numbers here when I'm talking about the most interesting. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? over in the SEC West, feel free to just yell it out. Type it in the old live chat because it is not even close. And it's a team we mentioned already that the Gamecocks beat last year. And that has a lot to do with it. But the original hire, I think, made a lot of people scratch their heads or say, that's something. Going to get rid of Gus Malzahn for Ryan Harsin, huh? Auburn at the top of the list, not even close. And I mentioned the strength of schedule article that came out on CBSSports.com. We were talking about that yesterday where the Gamecocks were 10th. So from a strength of schedule, what is facing you kind of thing, I mean, the Gamecocks have been in the top 10 in the country so many years. To be ranked 10th from an SEC standpoint, about as good as you can do. Auburn, not so much. They're number one. And maybe it has to do with how they finished last year as well, but it also has to do with playing at Georgia and at Alabama and having a week 3 out-of-conference game with Penn State. At Ole Miss, and the bye weeks in week 8. And Barrett Salee, who wrote the article again, says, if Harsin stays employed, it'll be one of the most miraculous coaching jobs in recent memory. So Auburn football, man, is maybe the best example, one of the best examples of, okay, if you're going to get rid of a guy, you better have an upgrade. If you're going to get rid of how are we going to term Gus Malzahn? Solid? Slightly above average head coach? That's how I'd put him. I never thought Gus Malzahn was one of the best coaches in the SEC, but I certainly didn't think he was one of the worst. So that's how I see the Malzahn run at Auburn. And Craig says Auburn and Florida in weird spots. Well, they're in weird spots in different ways, right? Florida with year number 1 and Billy Napier, a different kind of weird. Auburn, I got no sympathy for them, and with their fans, maybe I see what you're saying there. It's almost like there's a relatively large percentage of the fan base that would prefer the football program to lose games so they can change coaches. South Carolina's been there. South Carolina might be there with a baseball program right now. But to be there in year number 2 is crazy to me from a football standpoint, having even seen the Will Muschamp run, right? I mean, Gamecock fans saw improvement in year 1, a big year 2, and an Outback Bowl win, and turned out to be the pinnacle of the Will Muschamp tenure, unfortunately. And then things fell off. But a lot of things got to go wrong for you as a new football coach, even at Auburn, to roll into year 2 on I think it's got to be the hottest seat in the country right now. And a lot of things went wrong for Auburn year 1. There's no doubt about it. York weighing in for the morning UFA crew. Good morning to you, York, talking a bunch of SEC football. And this came off of a big article on ESPN.com, kind of their headline this morning. With Tennessee football, sit-down Q&A with Josh Heupel going into year number 2. And Tennessee, to me, right up there at the top of the list, the most interesting SEC programs out there. I would put them 3rd right now because of all the expectations that Josh Heupel's going to face and how spoiled Tennessee football fans have been through the years. Now, the last decade, different. Got it? I mean, a lot like Gamecock baseball fans. I think it's very similar. I know my buddy Bill Gunter used to equate Gamecock baseball with Alabama football. Not quite. To me, they're not quite the same. I'd say LSU baseball might be like Alabama football. I think it's a better comparison. Gamecock baseball, a lot like Tennessee football. Perennial powerhouse program, no doubt. not necessarily the preeminent program, even in the conference and then in the country. I think that's a very fair comparison. And now Tennessee got to see their team improve massively and do it in a way that fans love, right? We love to see points. We love to see your team have the ability to score almost at any point in the game. And when your coach was Jeremy Pruitt and your quarterback was Jared Garantano for as many games as Tennessee had recently, when your coach before that was Derek Dooley, yeah, I think it's only fair to say that Tennessee fans have to feel over the moon in a lot of ways after Josh Heupel year number one, knowing the NCAA issues and the whole thing. But now that it only stands to reason, the expectation is going to be that much higher in year two, and the margin is so thin in the SEC. Now, maybe this year with the East being pretty wide open outside of what are we going to call Kentucky? Maybe Kentucky football is what Gus Malzahn was as a coach, right? As far as what you expect to get every single year, reputation, I think Kentucky football might be above average. Not the best in the SEC. Nobody's saying that at all, but nobody's put them at the bottom either right now. I think that's a fair comparison. But Tennessee football will never be satisfied with being in the middle of the pack in the SEC East. And then as soon as these divisions get gone here relatively soon, I think we all assume is going to happen with Texas and Oklahoma coming into the league, they will not be satisfied with not being relevant. And that's the challenge Josh Heupel faces. I think that's a much larger one than Shane Beamer faces at South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina fans want to win too, but they haven't been conditioned to winning and winning a bunch of championships and then have gone completely dry for as long as Tennessee has too. So let's get more to Auburn now. Whew. Coming in from outside of the SEC to begin with, Boise State, all the way across the country. You're taking over for a coach that got a lot of credit for a national championship, being the offensive coordinator back in 2010 with Cam Newton and company. And Gene Chizik got, 2 years after that? Ed Orgeron treatment. Nobody at Auburn was building a trophy, making a statue, I should say, for Gene Chizik after the national championship run. It is, all right, when's the next one coming? And remember, Malzahn had him playing for the championship not too long after that, right? And so that's why I put him, I have pretty high regard for Gus Malzahn. I think he's a good football coach. And I think Auburn, a lot like Tennessee, is a nearly impossible place these days. A lot like Florida, it's nearly impossible to have any kind of coaching stability unless you're winning championships. 2 out of 3 years? Certainly every other year. You got to be winning your division right there at it. And if not, man, it's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Now, I don't feel bad for these guys. They're making a ton of money, and they know what they're getting themselves into, or if they don't, it's their fault. But the Auburn football situation, absolutely most interesting to me going into 2022. Tennessee and Florida right below there. And then things do get a little calmer real quick, I think, in the SEC. Mississippi State just re-upped Mike Leach. And I didn't realize, I guess in the state of Mississippi, you can't have more than a 4-year contract, which was interesting to me. So he's got that now, and I think they paid him maybe $500,000 more, $5.5 million instead of $5. And I think Leach is a pretty good fit at Mississippi State in that he's going to win a game or two that he shouldn't win. He's also going to lose some, but he makes Mississippi State a lot more interesting than a lot of other coaches would. Put it that way. He's not going to challenge for a championship. I think we would be shocked if that happens. But they're not embarrassing. They're not guaranteed to be at the bottom of the SEC West every year with him. And I think that's kind of what Mississippi State football is. It kind of goes into Teddy D's question about Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin. Not bottom of the barrel in the SEC West. Guaranteed. I mean, they might finish there. Who knows? But I think anything above that is what you want at Ole Miss. And then you add in Lane Kiffin and everything that comes with him, and I think it's a great fit at Ole Miss. I mean, you could very much describe Lane Kiffin himself as a rebel, right? When Mississippi State changes their mascot to the Pirates, then it'll be a perfect mix in the state of Mississippi. So you got those programs cruising, in my opinion. I mean, I could also see, even though Mike Leach was just re-upped, if they have a bad year, that he might not be their coach next year. Could see that happening as well. But you got those guys in the West, the Mississippi schools. You got the Alabama schools that we touched on. Auburn, number one. Alabama is what they are. No need to talk about them right now. Who else we got going over there in the West now to talk about going into 2022 from just an interest level standpoint? Arkansas, week 2 for the Gamecocks. They seem to be riding high and feeling good about where their program is, and they should. Yeah, Pittman's perfect at Arkansas. Another great fit. You're right, Craig. And the early success is a main component of that, right? You can't be a perfect fit at a place if you don't win. And these days in college football, if you don't win early. Shane Beamer would not be looked at right now how he's being looked at had Carolina not beaten Florida and not beaten Auburn, right? 4 wins wouldn't do it because you don't win those games. You don't get to the bowl game and beat North Carolina. I mean, imagine that, right? How different the perception in the South Carolina program and Shane Beamer would be right now had they been 4-8. Massively different. So Arkansas in a similar way, right? They've won those games. You got to give Sam Pittman credit, and they seem to be poised for a good year, a top 25 like year. It's going to be a big challenge in week number 2 for the Gamecocks to go out there and come back with a win, and then turn around and play Georgia the next week. So that's 5 of the 7. Who am I leaving out there over in the West? I always think of Missouri, Texas A&M. Oh, yeah. How about that? That's when you know your conference is ridiculous. It's taken an hour and 23 minutes. We've been talking about SEC football most of the morning for me to even think about. I mentioned Jimbo and Saban earlier, but I wasn't thinking an A&M Alabama thing. I was just thinking personally. Jimbo and Nick Saban. Then you got Texas A&M, which at this time last year, I think, was probably the most interesting situation in the SEC because they were coming off of that one-loss year, right? And right on the outside of the college football playoff, and so many expectations going in. Now, finishing 8-4 last year was a disappointment for Texas A&M. Flat out. Call it what it is. Especially losing to LSU last year with the type of season they had. I think Mississippi State was a loss as well. But beating Alabama bought Jimbo Fisher a lot of good grace, I think, with Texas A&M fans. What he did, what was it, a couple of months ago now? 6 weeks ago, whatever it was. Standing up for his program in the recruiting class and getting after Nick Saban how he did. That gives him a lot of leash with the program. Now, I feel like 8 wins for them, bare minimum. You don't win 8 games at a program where you filled in your name and they've given you a trophy, a national championship trophy, and just waiting for you to fill in the year. You're talking as confidently and as aggressively as you're talking when you're Jimbo Fisher. You got to win 8 games. So from that standpoint, I mean, they're the anti-Ole Miss and Mississippi State fan base right now, Texas A&M. And again, you got to understand the Texas A&M fan base going into this season and through the years, historically, little brother to Texas, not winning championships year after year after year, have all the money in the world. And now, with the name, image, and likeness advantage that they have, call it what you want. You want to be Nick Saban and say they bought the recruiting classes or their recruiting class? I find it hard to not believe that. You want to be Jimbo Fisher and say no rules or laws were broken? Okay. I find that hard not to believe, too. I'm sure you didn't. Just the NCAA was so dumb with how they didn't come up with hardly any framework here that, yeah, you can do that these days. That's what it is. Roger pointed out that Arkansas is a place that Carolina's just never played well for the most part, no doubt. Yeah, and then York mentions that Jimbo's got to get more than the 8 wins Kevin Sumlin was averaging. So again, you got to think about who you took over for, what the standard was for that coach. And it's very much Georgia at a lower level, right? Where you had a pretty good coach. The program was in pretty good shape. I mean, Kevin Sumlin could always play against Alabama. Johnny Manziel won a Heisman Trophy for you. And yet championships were never in order, didn't happen, and turned out to be just not good enough for as long as it was. And then Jimbo Fisher comes in with a national championship under his belt, seeing it end so poorly at Florida State. And now you're in that environment. I love that we didn't even talk about Texas A&M, didn't even get to them. Because, let's see, if I'm ranking interest levels of programs in the West, Auburn far and away number 1, and I think A&M's got to be number 2. Just because of the old keeping the finger on the pulse with Jimbo Fisher and the trajectory that he's talked, all the expectation that comes along with a big-time recruiting class. Going right after Nick Saban publicly and knowing just the Texas A&M environment, how desperate they are to win football games, to win championships. Oh, fascinating where they are in 2022 and going to be so fun to watch. I mean, the Auburn Texas A&M game, for instance, I got to see when they play. That one going to be really interesting. Texas A&M, by the way, 8th in the strength of schedule ranking from CBS Sports. Travel to Alabama, A&M does this year. I think we all remember writing that on our calendars, early October, I think it is. And they're playing Florida in the SEC East as the rotating opponent. Arkansas, going to be a neutral site game. So kind of down a home game, I think. From an SEC perspective, they just get 3 home games. They got a non-conference matchup. Miami comes into Texas A&M this year, and Appalachian State in week 2. Right before that Miami game in week 3. Interesting one, for sure. And I want to see when that Auburn game is, because I think you got to take bets on whether Brian Harsin will be the coach of Auburn against Texas A&M this year. And if it's not happening early, then I'm gonna bet that's a no. So Auburn is down on the list here. Yeah, it doesn't happen to November 12th. I will be very surprised if Brian Harsin is the Auburn coach against Texas A&M this year. Now I'm going to look up the Auburn schedule and tell you why. So a couple of non-conference games to start. Mercer, San Jose State. San Jose State, actually. I'm an Auburn fan. I might be concerned about that one. But you get 0 credit, by and large, for winning those. Penn State is week 3. That's going to be the CBS game at 3:30. Then Missouri and LSU follow. Those are all home games. So from that standpoint, you get a break from the schedule. Kind of, right? From that standpoint, I think Auburn fans expect you to win all of those games except maybe Penn State. If you don't go 4-1 in your first 5 games, heat on Brian Harsin, right? And that would include a win against either LSU or Penn State. And then after that, at Georgia, October 8th, at Ole Miss, October 15th. Arkansas at home, at Mississippi State before that Texas A&M game. So now that I look at it, it doesn't seem that terrible, the schedule. But it's going to be that stretch, right? I mean, the SEC, you can't lose to Missouri. You can't lose to LSU this year at home where they are. You need to beat Ole Miss at Ole Miss. You need to beat Arkansas at home. You need to win at Mississippi State, all of those. But I could see Auburn doing that. And that's a hilarious part, really, about watching Auburn from my position. Well, I don't know, Craig. It doesn't seem as brutal as I thought it would be as I went through it. Troy says the SEC West is loaded. I can see Auburn being picked last at media days. Yeah, me too. Who else you going to pick, right? Mississippi State, Ole Miss? I don't think you're going to pick Ole Miss. Maybe Mississippi State. But that's also the thing, too. Auburn was picked last in baseball, one of the last 4 teams standing. So fascinating to see what's going on over there. Let's see, did I miss anybody or did I just not count? Oh, I didn't count LSU. Another hilarious part of this SEC West discussion, right? Holy. Classic. Because LSU might be in a different category. They might not just be the most interesting program right now in the SEC. I think probably nationally, it has to be number 1, right? I can't even believe I didn't get to them. I mentioned Brian Kelly earlier, but I feel like that's such a total different discussion when a dude has a fake Southern accent when he's talking to his own fans. What are we doing? He's already come out and said that it's a lot easier for him to recruit at LSU, I think, than at Notre Dame. Me saying that sentence is crazy to hear. But I think he was talking about just having the ability to get Louisiana guys specifically, right? That they just weren't options at Notre Dame, or they certainly weren't worth all the trouble that it would have been, all the effort that it would have taken. And that's obvious. LSU should always, will always be expected to own the state of Louisiana from a football recruiting standpoint. The question becomes, how nationally relevant can you be? Because you don't go from Notre Dame anywhere unless you expect to be nationally relevant every year and have a really good chance to win a national title, which LSU just did a couple of years ago. Roger, interesting comment here. Let's get to Craig's first, though. Not hard for a new coach at Notre Dame to recruit. They don't even have a 3-star and are ranked second. Yeah, nationally, I mean, you should be able to coach nationally and to recruit nationally at Notre Dame. And Marcus Freeman clearly doing that, taking over for Brian Kelly. In a way, Brian Harsin was an underwhelming hire, similar to Mark Kingston, different sport. We shall see if Kingston's still around for the 2024 season. Yeah, and that's the thing that, man, you better be confident as an athletic director. And to me, it's a sign of confidence, self-confidence, that you bring in a guy that you know your fan base isn't going to embrace immediately, isn't going to hear the name and say, oh, yeah, good hire. Eric Bakich for Clemson baseball. I don't know how a Clemson fan could have heard him attached to Michigan, knowing that he got his team to a national championship series a couple of years ago, said, oh, yeah, good hire, knowing that he'd coached there before just 1 year, but then been Tim Corbin's right-hand man at Vanderbilt for a long time. Good hire. And again, I'm not trying to tell you that immediate public perception always equals success. It doesn't. But it does have an effect on the program. Shane Beamer's hire at South Carolina came with, I think, a more positive than negative reaction, but not an overwhelmingly positive reaction. Guy hadn't been a head coach before. Hadn't been a coordinator. We know what his dad did, yeah. But what has he done? You know, the former players are behind him, but that's the best you could do. I think that's how a lot of Gamecock fans reacted to it. That was kind of my thought process. But since then, I mean, immediately at the press conference, speaking how no South Carolina football coach, no coach that I've ever heard talked. And then seeing how those former players have rallied around him, how he has created a unique identity, I think changed that opinion in a big way. But again, it also combined with a win over Florida, a win over Auburn in year number 1. Now, what happens in year 2? That is on a much lower level than the Brian Harsin situation at Auburn, knowing where that program has been, both highs and lows, and the boosters that run the board and the whole thing, man. How they're the Gene Chizik quick exit after national championship, Gus Malzahn up and down results, and then out straight over to UCF, and then Brian Harsin. Yeah, strange. But let's get back to the LSU situation, man. Looking forward to talking to at least one person around that program, because that hire, when I first heard it, I was like, whoa, really? Really, in both ways. Like, really, Brian Kelly wants to do that? And the other way was, really, LSU, that was an option? And again, we kind of started this morning talking about the Florida program on the east side and how I thought, and I think it was pretty much the accepted narrative that Billy Napier was just kind of biding his time. And ideally, the LSU job was where he was headed. It seemed to be that was the path. That clearly didn't happen. And the fact that Brian Kelly came down. I mean, LSU went from Mr. Louisiana and Ed Orgeron, leading you to a national championship, and then seemingly celebrating Mardi Gras style every day afterwards for a year plus or whatever it is, and just irresponsibly watching the program go where off the tracks, to now a complete foreigner when it comes to Louisiana, the South, the Southeast, in Brian Kelly. And no doubt a good football coach. But how will it fit in the state of Louisiana? You win games, he's going to be just fine, right? Nick Saban won a title at Louisiana. He's not a Louisiana guy at all. He's the king of college football at Alabama, not an Alabama guy at all. So it's not a prerequisite. It is not required. But those guys didn't come off of national championship winning coaches who, were basically the face of the state. Ed Orgeron was the face of Louisiana. Still is to me. I don't think he might always be in my lifetime. But Archie Manning is the only other one that pops in my head. Drew Brees. Drew Brees is an Indiana guy. Was with the Saints as long as he was. Archie Manning, at least having played down at Ole Miss and gone over the Saints, much more kind of a Louisiana thing. And then I think that's kind of the Manning home base, right? New Orleans. But I don't know how much Brian Kelly will be able to get away with some comments that weren't taken personally, maybe, when he was the coach at Notre Dame, because it's a national deal. Notre Dame is off by itself, right? I know they played in the ACC not too long ago for a season, the COVID stuff, and they are connected to the ACC, no doubt. Even in football, where they're not technically a member, right? But their rivalries are just so different, right? The Southern Cal thing is so far away, and then Southern Cal has just not been nationally relevant or nearly what they used to be. I mean, how much tarnish can you put on a program, O.J. Simpson and Reggie Bush, right? And then since Pete Carroll has left, those teams just haven't been anywhere close to what they were. So that national rivalry, I think, nowhere near what it was. We don't care nearly as much. The Michigan-Notre Dame thing, not what it used to be, for sure. I mean, Notre Dame and Clemson maybe have kind of gotten after each other as much as anybody, I feel like, recently, which is mind-boggling for me to say. It just shows me how much college football has changed recently. But how Brian Kelly now puts his fingerprints and personality on that program and what it ends up becoming, man, it's going to be so fun to watch. That one combined with Jimbo Fisher over there, those two programs that I didn't even get to. And I think it's because Texas A&M not part of the SEC for so long. It's still difficult for me to consider them in my mind automatically an SEC program. And Brian Kelly coming with such the national reputation from Notre Dame, and that one coming so far out of left field from my perspective that it is going to be, I mean, it's just an anomaly. It is just another deal. Troy says, speaking of the ACC, the ACC network making the announcement yesterday, they did it on their show, the Packer and Durham deal, that they're having their last show on the ACC network this Friday. And Troy, being a Clemson guy, is bummed by that. You know, Mark Packer used to be on the same radio station in Columbia as I was, and we crossed paths a time or two. Always a really kind guy, energetic guy, and have admired everything that he has built up in his career, and always equated seeing his dad, Billy Packer, if he was doing a game back in the day, it was a big game, big basketball game. So I hear you, Troy. Thanks for that note, for sure. It's been a good run. I mean, they basically started the ACC network, right? And been kind of the signature show there in the mornings. And now both of them, they said yesterday, they're going to remain with the ACC network. They're just going to do it in different capacities. It sounds like Wes Durham is going to be doing more play-by-play stuff and maybe not the morning talk show every single morning. I'm guessing Mark Packer will, and they'll just give him a different partner maybe. I don't know. They will announce it soon. So you'll find out. And Troy, I would say, yeah, it stinks when a show ends, but it sounds to me like you're going to be getting something pretty similar, at least from the Packer standpoint. And it probably won't change in tone very much, I wouldn't imagine. But it's crazy to me that as I was watching this announcement on social media, just I think about 4 minutes worth of it, that I saw on social media yesterday, that they cut to Mark Packer's little studio and the ESPN executive was actually sitting on the chair beside him. It was the weirdest thing ever. Like, not talking, not mic'd up. It was just like the physical embodiment of the network over his shoulder. Made me thankful for the unrestricted free agent here. No, that's not a thing. And it's crazy to me that is how it still works. And I guess that's how it's always going to work with TV networks. As long as we have TV networks. When do we stop calling them TV networks, by the way? My last radio station I worked for, the Cumulus, has changed kind of their tagline to an audio-driven media company. Is that what our TV station's going to do? That the opposite, video-driven digital media? It's got to be coming, right? Because, I mean, you can watch this on your TV. My kids would prefer to watch YouTube now than anything else. That's what they do. You guys seen this Dodger Films thing? This is fascinating to me. A bunch of guys and girls. I think they might have gotten together. Might have just been friends growing up out in LA, but I think they play video games on the internet too. Like, they put their video games up and then they play like little recreational softball and baseball games. Film them, do play-by-play of them. This is what my 7-year-old's all about these days, watching TV. I get caught up in it too. Like, hey, it's interesting watching. Like, the guy doing the camera work and the play-by-play he's into it, and it's easy to get into, man. But I just bring that up because TV is different. Yeah, Craig says the fact that YouTube's still free is mind-boggling. Well, YouTube TV is not, and that's what I have as well, which I mean, never thought I would cut the cord. I never thought that would be a possibility in my life, much less watch ESPN on my phone, right? But that's part of where we are, the old changing landscape here. Glad you guys are latched on to this thing today. Been fun talking football, man. And I think June 30th was a big reason why. And I think you guys are going to be good. I think YouTube knows it's free. I think their business model they're pretty good with the ads they got baked in. I think you're going to be all right for a while. But you guys are doing this on YouTube. You know that, right? As long as you know. So I might have to re-rank them now in the SEC because I wasn't even considering Texas A&M and LSU like a dummy. Talking about just interest level in programs this year. Auburn's still number one. They just are. It's a different deal. And because of the hot seat level, I think Auburn's still got to be number one. I'm writing them down right now, so I make sure to remember this. I'm going Auburn 1. I think I got to go LSU 2. 3 is A&M. Programs I'm most interested in. 4, Florida. 5, Tennessee. Whew. And it would be difficult for me. I know it's complete SEC bias, but I don't know if you get anybody to crack that top 5 outside of the SEC this year. As far as just, this is going to be fascinating to watch for so many reasons. I mean, I guess I'd go Alabama 6 just because of the smoke with Nick Saban. and company. The fact that finally one of his assistants knocked him off the mountain there, and the number one recruiting class wasn't his, and he was challenged publicly and the whole thing. And how's that going to work out? I mean, on the field, I think we all still see Alabama maybe losing 2 games. That would be a bad year for them. Bryce Young's fantastic, more than lived up to the expectations last year. Fun to watch. Their offense just continues to adapt, move up and down the field. Defense is ridiculous all over the place. So unfortunately, don't expect a lot of close games there. So I can't get too interested. If you're not playing very many close games, that's why Auburn is number 1. They're going to be in a lot of games if they're lucky, right? And if they're not, they're going to have a different head coach or an interim coach, or it'll just be a mess. LSU at 2, seeing what they were last year, coming off a national championship. Add in Brian Kelly, and he's got a lot of Nick Saban in him from where I sit. If it's not going his way, he is not going to be the bigger person and handle it in a very mature way, is how I see it on the field. Anyway, he's going to throw some tantrums and try to get his way for sure. Then you got Texas A&M out there, and their expectation has to be second in the West at worst, right? This year, Arkansas sneaks up on them, has a better season. LSU has a better season than Texas A&M. Ooh. You're going to see a lot of problems that Jimbo Fisher is going to be having, because I can guarantee Texas A&M fans absolutely think now that they're going to have, if not the number 1 recruiting class in the country, a top 5 recruiting class in the country for the foreseeable future. I mean, infinity is probably what they're thinking, right? You got the collective, they got the oil money. How can you not? And Jimbo Fisher doesn't deserve the credit for that. Like, they might be giving him some credit now, and they love how he stood up to Nick Saban, and they beat Alabama last year. Also lost 4 other games. And if that continues to be the trend, all that oil money will still be sitting there. And Jimbo Fisher will have a bunch of it, but he won't be the head coach there too much longer if they continue to lose 4 games and not challenge for the SEC West. So you had a challenge the year before. Then you had an Alabama win last year, but those 4 other losses. What happens next? So A&M at 3. I mean, if you want to tell me they're your number 1, I get it. You want to tell me they're number 2, I get it. I understand why you might be massively interested in Florida and Tennessee. I am too. First official sneeze on the program. Glad I was able to get the mute button involved there. But those top 5 programs, Auburn, LSU, A&M, Florida, and Tennessee. And again, top 5 in interest alone. Certainly don't consider them to be the top 5 programs overall in SEC football. But from an interest standpoint, absolutely. And I don't know if we've ever had a more interesting season set up in college football. But we come at it from the SEC perspective, but because of all of these factors, right? We've never seen that Jimbo Saban thing publicly play out. We've never seen name, image, and likeness affect recruiting as much as it is as we sit here today. We've never seen the transfer portal be such an important part of college football as we sit here right now. And it just brings programs, I think, in conflict that much more. Then you throw in, the Notre Dame coach just happened to take over for a program that recently won the national championship and then whose coach went a little bit crazy. Oh, you got one program in the same state as Alabama that has forever seen themselves as equal to Alabama, has never quite been that, and went out and hired somebody from Boise State to coach them and lost to South Carolina, among others, in year number one. After having never lost to South Carolina for how long? Ever, I think it was. Now lost 2 games in a row to South Carolina. From an Auburn standpoint, and these aren't like the banner years of South Carolina, by the way. One of those years, it was one of 2 wins. From an Auburn standpoint, man, could not be more unacceptable. Then you got Florida thinking they are a championship program, not just an SEC championship program, a national championship program. Just played for the SEC championship a few years ago with Jim McElwain as their coach, right? And he went a little crazy. Then you brought in the prodigal son. You welcomed him back. Dan Mullen, come on back, man. We know it was really you. Not so much that Urban Meyer guy that led us to the national championships back in the day. Come on in, man. Take over. You got Mississippi State to number 1. Automatically going to get us back to national relevance. Oh, you don't want to recruit every single day and tell us it's the most important thing in the world? And you think you could go coach in the NFL and not have to deal with name, image, and likeness and a changing college football landscape where coaches have less and less power, and that just didn't work for you? Oh, okay. Who's going to pay you millions of dollars to go off and not coach anymore? And let's bring in a rising star in college football, let's say. Let's call Billy Napier, but has always had some other stuff attached to him reputation-wise in how he's gotten there. And now you see a big-time quarterback prospect go to Miami. See South Carolina, of all people, taking a big-time linebacker out of the state. What's going on with Billy Napier? He hadn't even played a game. So the Florida situation, man, fantastic to keep an eye on. Tennessee, again, Josh Heupel is a relatively low-key guy, right? So I don't think you're going to get anything publicly out of him that you get from those other 4 programs. I mean, Brian Harsin isn't necessarily a lightning rod kind of guy, but the way that program has been perceived publicly, the way that former players have come out, both accusing him of not being a good leader and then supporting him, those on the other side kind of in reaction to that. Brian Kelly to LSU from Notre Dame, the fake Southern accent. Jimbo Fisher just going right at Nick Saban, but also not even able to beat LSU last year. Florida with Napier, and then Tennessee's Rocky Top expectations after a good year, but just still 7-6, man. Still so far to go with Tennessee. South Carolina fans know how far 7-6 is too to national relevance, right? Oh man, and we're just wrapping up June. Wrapping up the program as well today. Appreciate you guys. Hey, DC, attaboy, just followed us on Facebook. Nice work. Yeah, so we got the Facebook page over there, Tim Hill UFA. If you can, give that thing a like. That'll help others see it. You know, it's fascinating to me how much people see and what people see when they see it, and the algorithms involved in the social media and the whole thing. I'm certainly not an expert, doing what I can do, and really appreciate you guys helping out. Jason says another quality UFA episode. Appreciate that. Colette giving us an emoji of some sort. I think that's a good one. Looks like a smile. That's good. So really appreciate you guys being a part of the program, especially the live stream. But if you're checking out the podcast version as well, feel free to comment on that at any point. Call me out on anything. DC, spreading the word. Much appreciated, sir. Trying to do the same on all your stuff. Thank you, sir. And thank you for listening and watching. We'll do it again tomorrow, 8 to 10 on the live stream. That'll do it today. That'll do it for June. Tim Hill, unrestricted free agent.